I'm going to read you Gareth Gore's article that he published for the National Catholic Reporter, had him write this for them. This is under the opinion guest voices category, which I think is kind of funny. But it says, Gareth Gore, what I told Pope Leo about my research into Opus Dei. And let's just read what he had to say, shall we? This was published March 17th. I was in Silicon Valley for a work trip a few years ago when a curious message flashed up on my phone. Podrías contactarme? Es importante. It's read. Can you get in touch? It's important. The message was from Pedro Salinas, a fellow journalist from Peru whose excellent work had helped to bring about the suppression of an abusive Catholic group there, the SAV, and who I had gotten to know through my own work exposing the abuses of Opus Dei. We had last spoken in early December when we both appeared at a conference in Argentina, and so my first instinct on seeing the message was to assume the worst. Opus Dei is threatening to sue, I thought. Again! I called him from a parking lot across the street from the futuristic Googleplex campus in Mountain View, where I had just been to meet with a contact. Pedro had come to know Pope Leo, known as Cardinal Robert Prevost back then, through his work detailing widespread abuse inside the sodality of Christian life, and the two remained in touch. Pedro explained to me that the Pope was well aware of my own work on Opus Dei, and that he was keen to speak with me in a private audience, just the two of us. Would I be open to meeting him? It took a minute to compose myself before replying, yes, of course I would. Over the next few days, I exchanged WhatsApp messages with an intermediary at the Vatican who had been asked to arrange the meeting. Then the lines of communication went mysteriously quiet. Had someone inside the Holy See scuppered the meeting, I wondered? Was my audience with the Pope being postponed indefinitely? After reporting on Opus Dei for the past 7 years, I know all too well about the group's influence inside the Vatican. Thankfully, my suspicions proved misplaced. 2 weeks later, confirmation arrived in the form of an ornate invitation from the prelature of the papal household. On the morning of March 16th, I presented myself to the Swiss guards outside the main entrance to the Apostolic Palace and showed them my invitation and passport. I had flown in from my home in London the previous evening. They ushered me into the Pontifical Palace and into a wood-paneled elevator. After that, I was taken through various ornate rooms to a first waiting area and then to a second, where I was told to leave my phone. After a short while, I was taken into the private library where the Pope posed for pictures with me and congratulated me on my book, which he called a rigorous piece of work. We then sat down and began our conversation. Here's a picture. Here's Gareth. He's holding his book. There's the Pope with a look of, I don't know what that facial expression could be described as. I'm not really sure, but they're having their meeting. Anyone who has read my Substack before will know how critical I've been about the way that the Catholic Church has handled, or more accurately, mishandled, decades of abuse allegations made against Opus Dei. The group has been accused of a long list of misdeeds, of grooming children, of trafficking and enslaving young girls, and drugging members to hide the mental health epidemic within its ranks. It also was accused of breaking the seal of the confessional and using spiritual guidance sessions to collect information about its members so that it can manipulate them into serving its own interests. There are literally hundreds of testimonies from victims online on websites such as opuslibros.org and Reddit. Shout out Opus Dei Exposed. I have been outspoken about the Church's complete failure to address these very serious abuses. While Pope Francis raised hopes among victims when he issued a surprise motu proprio in July 2022, ordering Opus Dei to rewrite its statutes, in the years that have passed since, it began to look increasingly like reform of the group was little more than a public relations exercise. The Vatican never once reached out to former members to understand what it was that needed reforming. In fact, it completely ignored approaches from people who offered to help with information and documents smuggled out of the organization. My conclusion was that the Vatican didn't want to know the truth. I suspected that it was worried that a full investigation into Opus Dei might be hugely embarrassing for the Church. I deduced that it was content with just making a few superficial changes and moving on without properly understanding or tackling the problem. But my meeting with the Pope forces me to reassess these conclusions. It is, of course, possible that Leo invited me to meet him to make it look like he was hearing from all parties after meeting with the leader of Opus Dei twice in the past year. But it is also possible that he actually wants to do the right thing, that he wants to hear the truth. I'm not going to go into detail about what the Pope told me or what questions he asked. I will leave it to the Vatican to decide what it wants to say about the meeting. But I am very happy to say what I said in the meeting and what information I provided to him. I believe such transparency is important. Not only does it offer hope to Opus Dei's many victims that these allegations are now being heard, but perhaps even more importantly, it creates a public record of what the Pope and wider Vatican are now aware of. By putting on record what information I shared with the Pope and the meeting, nobody can now turn around and say, well, we didn't know. And I already said earlier in this video why I think it's completely ridiculous for the Catholic Church to be claiming ignorance on any of this, but I digress. I spoke at length about what former members had told me about the way that Opus Dei operates, about how the group abuses the legitimacy conferred upon it by the Catholic Church to lure unsuspecting victims into its clutches. I detailed allegations about how the group actively targets young children, how it grooms and manipulates them into a lifelong commitment to serving its interests from the tender age of 10 or 11, without their parents ever being consulted. I shared testimonies and documents backing this up and offered to connect the Vatican with people who were involved in such grooming who will testify to these allegations. I also shared with the Pope documents and testimonies detailing how the group controls and manipulates the lives of its members and how it is accused of breaking the seal of confession and abusing spiritual guidance sessions to collect information about unsuspecting Catholics so that it can manipulate and take advantage of them. I talked about how Opus Dei abuses the faith of its members to contract money, favors, and obedience. I argued that the group should be considered an abusive cult that has zero regard for its victims or the wider church. I also shared disturbing firsthand accounts shared with me of, and this is where I would ask that you hearken back to the article that we just read a moment ago, of a psychiatric facility in the north of Spain known to those inside Opus Dei as La Cuarta Planta, the fourth floor, where members were quietly sent to be treated for the devastating impact that life inside the group has had on their mental well-being. I offered to connect the Vatican with people who had been treated there and former senior members of the organization who were pushed to send people to the facility. I also shared testimonies detailing the widespread use of prescription drugs to conceal mental illness and of members committing suicide. So this story from earlier out of Montevideo about Maria Luisa Giannoli is not some weird outlier. Like I said, it's a feature, not a bug. Naturally, I also spoke about the case in Argentina where Opus Dei has been formally accused of human trafficking, of luring vulnerable young girls into a life of servitude by offering them false promises of a good education and a better life, and then trafficking them around the world to work as unpaid servants. I personally handed the Pope a copy of the report written by Argentinian public prosecutors following a 2-year investigation into the group's practices. I also made it clear that this isn't a one-off, that similar allegations have surfaced in many other countries, including Ireland, France, Mexico, and Spain. I shared details of the network of hospitality schools set up across Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia accused of recruiting such girls. I also spoke about Opus Dei's efforts to cover up its abuses, of how it sought to threaten and intimidate me and my publisher into pulping my book, of how it launched a disinformation campaign to discredit and undermine me as a journalist, rather than answer for the allegations made against it. I detailed how this appeared to be the modus operandi of the group, how it previously used lawfare to intimidate whistleblowers and force websites to remove internal documents that could be considered damaging to its reputation, how the group had used its power and its wealth to cover up the truth and suppress the voices of many victims. I ended the meeting by imploring Leo to take action against this abusive group. I urged him to immediately launch an independent inquiry into Opus Dei abuses headed up by both clerical and lay experts, covering allegations of spiritual, psychological, emotional, physical, and financial abuse. I said that he should stand ready to close down the organization if the evidence merits it. I also urged him to reopen the beatification and canonization of the group's founder, Jose Maria Escrivá, because of information that has since emerged indicating potential irregularities in the process. I presented him with documents proving how Opus Dei's system of grooming, abuse, and control have been personally designed by this supposed saint. We ended the meeting on good terms and shook hands. As we parted, I urged the Pope to meet with victims for himself, to listen to their accounts and offer them some hope that justice might prevail. As I emerged out onto the street and headed to the airport for my flight back to London, my mind turned to them. So many people have had their lives ruined by this group. For years, they have felt that nobody was listening. But perhaps things are changing. One thing is certain: Leo's tenure will be marked in no small part by what he does next to address this abusive group. So I wanted to make sure that I read this because, again, this has been a major news development, and a lot of people have been talking about what it means that Pope Leo is meeting with a secular journalist who wrote what I think can be considered the most up-to-date and easily accessible historical account of Opus Dei, of this organization in the Catholic Church. And I've been very, very critical of the Catholic Church and of Pope Leo as well, for a myriad of different reasons under the umbrella of human rights and human dignity. So I'm not really willing to hand out an award for simply doing what should be pretty obvious, which is meeting with the people who are researching and working to understand the organization that is inside the religion that you are in charge of. I'm not really going to hand out an award for that, but I can acknowledge that I'm hopeful that it means that the Pope is going to do something of some sort, and what that is anyone's guess, of course, because nothing at all has happened yet. But like I had said earlier, because of the fact that this organization is a global organization, and I'm talking about the Catholic Church here, the Catholic Church is as much a governmental political entity as it is a religious organization. And so when they do things, when things are done publicly, it's reasonable to believe that it's done to send a message of some sort. And so what kind of message is the Vatican or Pope Leo sending by meeting with a secular journalist like Gareth Gore? I don't really know. Obviously, the hope is that it means that the Vatican and the Pope are very serious about addressing this issue, about addressing Opus Dei. But we won't know until something happens. And I said as much in my last deep dive video, which was the second and final part of my deep dive into the SCV organization. But until something substantial actually happens, until there is some sort of I've had it up to here with the symbology and the ceremony and the things that are done to make it look like something meaningful is happening, when in actuality on the ground nothing is changing in any way whatsoever. I'm hopeful that this means that there's a change in strategy occurring, but we simply will not know. And anyone can show up to a meeting. Anyone can shake a journalist's hand. Anyone can express their solidarity with journalists or victim survivors. But it's just statements. At the end of the day, it's just words coming out of somebody's mouth, and it doesn't actually indicate anything substantive until there is something substantive there. And so we will see what we will see with this, but I cannot think of a better person to have gone and met with Pope Leo to talk about Opus Dei, simply because his research has been so incredibly rigorous, and his book is completely unassailable, clearly, or it never would have seen the light of day. Opus Dei would have made damn sure of that. But they couldn't do that. They couldn't keep it from getting out and from being published. And it's an unassailable book in that regard. And the information that it contains therein is damning. If even a fraction of the information contained therein is true, and a good bit of it is verifiably true, this organization is screwed. It's not good. It's not good. And so I think it is good that this meeting happened. But I hope that it translates into something substantive and meaningful. And until it does, my position towards the Vatican Church and towards Pope Leo is going to remain the same, which is that the bar is in hell, and I'm not going to hand out awards for doing the bare minimum. Because it takes no effort to go to a meeting and shake someone's hand. I want to see actual reform from the top down. And until that happens, my opinion and my perspective is not really going to change a whole lot on the Catholic Church, on Pope Leo, on Opus Dei, or on anything else.